Hello, I would like to talk with you about the situation in the world and then especially in the Western world. I'm really worried about what is happening in the Western world. I've been worried for the last 15 years. It started at the moment that Russia attacked Georgia in 2008. So to be more precise, since the last 14 years. I saw Russia get away with this aggression initially started by Georgia. We have to be honest here, but still, there was no reason whatsoever for Russia to simply occupy territories of Georgia and now to annex it, because that is what is now about to happen. It started at that time, aggression, and the aggressor got away with it because we didn't want to get run into trouble with the aggressor, because we make a lot of money with him, we get easy oil and gas from him, we want to make political deals with him. So we looked away at the expense of Georgia, of course. In 2014, we saw the same situation when Russia attacked Ukraine for the first time. It occupied Crimea, it occupied a part of Donbass in the east of Ukraine. We made Minsk 2, and the main outcome of Minsk 2 was that if Ukraine would attack the occupied territories, it would break Minsk 2, it would lose Western support. So that was the perfect frozen conflict for Russia. And the cynical West, the weak West, played this game along with Russia because the West is not interested who rules over Donetsk or Luhansk or Crimea. The West is interested in calm down there and in business as usual with Russia. And that is exactly what we have seen. We saw some weak sanctions. I call them alibi sanctions. It gave the Western leaders an alibi for their own public opinion. Look, we are doing something, although they knew quite well that they would make no difference whatsoever on the ground in Ukraine. It was just for their own public opinion. The conflict was frozen at that. At least that is what these naive Western politicians hoped for, and they could do business as usual with Russia again. And we saw that because the trade volumes just before the Second World War, Second Ukraine War, on the 24th of February of this year, the trade volumes just before that war was never as big. It was completely business as usual, and even more than business as usual. Most business ever. That is what this cynical attitude, this opportunistic attitude of our leaders led to. And they hoped with their strategy with their weakness to signal weakness towards Russia. They hoped that if Russia understood that the West was quite weak, especially militarily, all the American tanks had disappeared from the mainland of Europe. The German, French, UK tank force were somewhat above 200 tanks, which is nothing for countries of over 65 million people. 200 tanks, that's really nothing. And other weapon systems, similar situation. They hoped to signal weakness, and that was a signal for Russia that the West would not attack because they simply couldn't, and that was a reason for that the peace would prevail. Of course, that is not how a bully thinks, like Putin. They think in terms of power. They see weakness and they say, "Oh, wait a minute, we can use that or abuse that," and that is exactly what has happened. Now, the West, through to its opportunism and weakness, has created the circumstances in which Putin makes the misjudgment, so that we have ended up in a big war, the biggest war since the end of the Second World War in Europe, a big war which we tried to prevent through our weakness. This was my worst nightmare. This is what I have been fearing for years, that through our weakness we would end up in a big war which we tried to prevent through our weakness. This is not how the world works. But we see it every time with the West. And why is this? Why does the West have such an attitude? This has simply to do with our political systems of leaders who have to win national elections. Yeah? And for them, it is much easier not to have vision and act accordingly, but to let incidents happen. Then the people want the politics to act. Then the people are open for sometimes not such nice measures. And then you only need to do that as a politician. It is much more complicated to develop a vision, to see what is most likely happening in the future, to act before, proactively, because then you need to convince the people of that vision and of the measures that are part of that the vision results into. Measures that are often painful. But to prevent this crisis, that requires a much higher level of leadership and the ability to communicate, the ability to develop vision, the ability to develop measures. This requires much more of our leaders, and of course, it's more risky on the short term because you can be wrong. You can fail in convincing the people for a crisis that isn't there yet. So they don't do it. They go for the easy way. They let the crisis happen, and then the crisis speaks for itself, and they only need to do what the people already want. That is much easier. There's far less risks, but it will lead to this leadership by incident, as I call it. You react to incidents, in contrast to leadership by vision. You act on the basis of what the vision delivers you, says to you. The consequence of this leadership by incident is that you put 2 steps forward, your normal development. Then comes the crisis, 1 step back, and then you put 2 steps forward again. That means in 5 steps, you in reality make 3 steps. Whereas if you lead based on leadership by vision, you prevent crisis, or the crisis will be far less worse. So in 5 steps, you maybe in reality put 4 steps or 4.5 steps forward. Your society will not have to take in the blow of the incident entirely, only a part of it, or not at all. The society will be less weakened because it does not have this setback, or far less of it. And you develop faster. You become a winner. Of course, there is more risk to it. Of course, you can be wrong so now and then. That is a risk. But in reality, to act on the basis of vision and have the leadership to take the measures, to accept the measures, to promote the measures, to convince the people of the measures necessary to prevent the crisis, makes you stronger. It makes you a winner. And that is not how the political generation, which has been ruling the West for such a long time now, that is not their political culture. And there are no people who can do that. You also need to have characters who can do that. Well, where does that end up into? It ends up into the euro crisis, for example, that we have seen. Specialists have said 100,000 times before the euro crisis, listen, this currency union of yours has very serious structural flaws. This can only go wrong. Our politicians did nothing until the euro crisis was there with enormous cost, with enormous damage. Only then, and also after hesitating a long time, they started to act on the last moment with the maximum damage for all of us. The situation in Syria, I was always, before the fundamentalist at the side of the opposition took over, so in the initial stages of the war, I was in favor of military action down there, in helping the opposition, which in the beginning was the more moderate opposition, with weapons and all they needed to win and to create a new Syria, but also to prevent a lot of other problems, for example, a regional war or the refugees. And in that time, ordinary people told me, I discussed a lot of on internet with many people who said I was crazy because I wanted military intervention. Look to Afghanistan, look to Iraq. Yeah? I said, you tell me, that is what they literally told me, put a fence around Syria and in 100 years we will look how it all ended. I said, Look in 3 years out of your kitchen window. Then you know how it all ended. Because then the refugees will be walking through your streets. And this is exactly what happened. And then these people, these same people, put pressure on our politicians. They threatened to en masse vote for ultra right-wing parties if these politicians didn't change it. And they had to move heaven and earth to make a deal with the autocrat Erdogan, for which we are literally still pay the price to stop these refugees. That is what you get if you refuse to have courage and vision and act accordingly. And with Mr. Putin, it is exactly the same. I just explained that in the beginning of this video. This short-sightedness, this cynicism, this weakness, it is simply inferior. Our leaders are inferior. We no longer have leaders like Churchill or de Gaulle, people with courage and vision who rose to the occasion. They are no longer there. We now have state employees, frightened people, visionless people, coward people, opportunistic people, not real leaders with courage. That is what is now leading the West, and we are paying a high price for this. And what is the highest price we pay, although it sounds somewhat abstract? If we look back to the last 15 years, our geopolitical position in the world deteriorated year by year, and the geostrategical position of the people like Xi in China or Putin in Russia improved year by year. Russia took Crimea and had an enormous aircraft carrier in the Black Sea, ruling down there de facto. Russia made a platform to take even more of Ukraine. Now it has doubled the size it had occupied before of Ukraine. Yeah, this is what you get. They built their strategic position because they do have the courage to act, to literally fight for it on the battlefield, to build up strong armies, to develop a vision for the longer term, work consistently to it, and act on the right moment for them. On the expense of all the others, of course. They go over dead bodies to increase their power. Yeah? And again, after 2014, after the cynical peace of Minsk II, leaders in France, Macron, Italy, Draghi, Schulz in Germany, do not give en masse weapons to Ukraine. A country like Estonia, with, I believe, 30 times as smaller population as France, gave twice as much value in military aid as France. This is an outrage. Yeah? Schulz, Macron, and Draghi, they want Ukraine to lose. They want them to accept an armistice once Russia is serious about it, because then it's quiet in the east, and then they can do their business with Russia again. Then the energy markets can stabilize, and that can stabilize the whole economy, solving a lot of political problems for them. And Ukraine, fuck them. These are not what I think, of course, but that is how these leaders think. Fuck them. What do we care? Who rules over Kherson? Who rules over Donetsk? Who rules over Luhansk? What do we care? That is how they think, these professional power cynics, but not real leaders. They are small politicians. And that is rotten. And that is what makes us lose. And the autocrats win. I hope that the people realize how cynical our politicians is, how weak they play their much better hands in the terms of cards. We still have better hands than Russia, better cards than Russia. But you should be convinced and courageous enough to act accordingly. And because our politicians are so small, our leaders, so-called leaders, we keep on losing. I hope everybody realizes that. I hope all the people put pressure on the leaders to change, especially their mentality, to show more courage, to show more vision, and to fight along with Ukraine to win. to give Putin his Waterloo in Ukraine. And if we don't want to send our own troops down there, send them at least all the weapons, intelligence, the whole other thing, energy, money, to make them win. Give Putin his Waterloo in Ukraine. If he sees that there is a power, a combination of Ukrainian Western power, which is bigger than his power, I tell you, then it will be all quiet at the Eastern Front. Then he has seen his master. And that is what people like him are susceptible to. That is what they respect. Power. Not the inferiority of our leaders and our policies. No. Courage, blunt power also on the battlefield. And the risk, if you want to get over that, the risk that you lose, the risk that you are militarily defeated, and nothing is more powerful to the position of a leader than a military defeat. Then we can create rest down there, and tranquility and peace. Not with the cynical, opportunistic weakness of our leaders. So, let's all support Ukraine. And let's put pressure on our governments to show courage. Because else, it will also get problematic for us. We cannot afford this. It will not stop in Ukraine. It will not stop in Moldova. He will go further. Because if we continue to lose, every day he will have less respect for us, more belief in himself, and more courage to act. And this is what we should prevent. We should prevent the even bigger war. And we do that by forcing him Putin, into his Waterloo in Ukraine.